Welcome to the Profit Dare. I have a question for you. Do you know what inflation is? In today's video, we're going to listen to a Peter Schiff clip as he defines inflation. Let's get into it.
And you can see all three of these parts up on YouTube. But where we started to argue was on the definition of inflation, because Jim kept talking about the fact that we weren't having any inflation. And I said, but Jim, we have massive inflation. What do you think the Federal Reserve is doing? They're inflating like crazy. They're printing all this money. Money supply is expanding. And then Jim said, no, that's not inflation. Inflation is rising prices. And I said, but Jim, that's not the definition of inflation. And he said, sure, you can't just make up any definition that you want. And I said, I'm not the one making it up. It's the government that made up a definition. And I pointed out to Jim that the original definition of inflation was an expansion of the supply of money and credit, and that it was the government that had altered the definition to suit its own purpose. And I said that he was simply helping to perpetuate government propaganda by pretending that inflation was what the government claims it is rather than what it actually is. Because the reason the government wants to claim that inflation is rising prices is because then it can pretend that it doesn't cause it. Right? If the government accepts the definition of inflation as an expansion of the supply of money, well, everybody knows who's expanding the supply of money. It's the Fed. So when you have an accurate definition of inflation, then you know exactly who's to blame. But if the government can fool people into believing that an effect of inflation is inflation, well, then they can blame it on whoever's raising the prices. And that's what they do. They blame it on greedy capitalists, or they blamed it on labor unions, or they blame it on OPEC, or they blame it on speculators, or can blame it on the Chinese. And so what Jim Rickards is doing is helping the government deflect blame away from itself and to mislead and fool the public into believing that inflation is rising prices, when in fact inflation is an expansion in the supply of money and credit, and it's the Federal Reserve that is doing the inflating. And in fact, I even pointed out to Jim Rickards that if he had an old dictionary and he looked up inflation, that would be the definition, that it would say inflation was an expansion of the money supply and credit supply. And Jim said no. He basically disagreed with me and said, no, inflation is increasing prices, and that's always been the definition. And I knew he was wrong about that.
So let's stop right there. And we all know prices in certain items increase, the basic supply and demand curve. And in all fairness, and all just full disclosure, Peter Schiff leans towards Austrian School of Economics. I am a subscriber to that school as well, although I'm not an economist. My son went to Grove City College, which is one of the premier Austrian schools in the world, and received a degree in economics. So I'm a big fan of Mises. I'm a big fan of Rothbard. A big fan of North and all these guys, right? So, in all fairness, that's the case. But this guy he's talking about said, well, that's an Austrian, made that definition up. But as you can see on this clip right here, this 1913 edition of the Webster's Dictionary says it's the undue expansion or increase from overuse set of currency. So that's the case, right? So and right now, at this time of the year this video is being recorded, it's summertime, we're opening our pool, and if I was to ask my wife, would you go increase the pool toys, she would wonder what in the world was I talking about. I said, well, the floaties, can you increase the floaties? And then she'd like, we don't need any more. And that's the definition this guy's using, not Peter Schiff, but the other guy. So she would say, oh, you want me to inflate the pool toys, right? So I'm expanding them, and that'd be the case, right? So the definitions are really clear, and the government has masterfully, very Orwellianly distanced himself from this issue by saying, oh, inflation is the increase of prices. No, that's an effect of that, but it all boils down to, or originates, the genesis of it all is the actual expansion of the money supply.
And in fact, somebody who had watched that emailed me a photograph, because they had an older Webster's Dictionary, I think from the 1960s. And so he sent me a picture, and then I tweeted out the picture. You can see it on my Twitter, but I've got it in front of me. I will read the definition right now. And here it is: inflation,
Oh,
the
good. It
act
shows
of
it. Nice.
inflating, the state of being inflated, sharp increase in amount of money and credit, causing advances in the general price level. So the definition of inflation mentions increases in the general price level, but only as the result of inflation, which had already defined as being a sharp increase in the amount of money and credit. That was the definition. Inflation, sharp increase in the amount of money and credit, causing advances in the price level. So advances in the price level are not inflation, they were caused by inflation. Inflation was defined as a sharp increase in the amount of money and credit, not an advancement in the general level of prices. The dictionary simply mentioned that inflation caused a increase in the level of prices, but defined the inflation itself as a sharp increase in the amount of money and credit.
Let's take this to a different, maybe a simpler way, because I know the whole concept behind money, and most people who are watching this channel aren't economists, right? We're people trying to, get ahead financially. But this inflation is eroding our purchasing power. And although maybe you might have a 401k that's maybe worth $1 million, has $1 million, has those zeros tied to it, it may be worth less. It's worth less than it was, say, 10 years ago. That same $1 million is worth less because inflation is an erosion of the value. But let's talk about one of the ways, because all money is an exchange, a medium of exchange. And we can think about movies of where, like Shawshank, which is one of my favorite movies, Shawshank Redemption. And the currency that Red traded in was a pack of smokes. And that was the constant, be like our version of money, or like back in the gold standard gold. But what if the warden all of a sudden just dropped a truckload of smokes into the population, and then it erodes that? Then all of a sudden, the whatever that, when someone wanted to buy something, get a certain things, I guess, can cost you a pack of smokes, and all of a sudden everyone had smokes, then the value of that is less, right? And that's how it is with our money. The more we have of it, the less it's worth.
And in fact, if you go far enough back into the past, if you get a dictionary maybe from the 1930s, right, and you look up inflation, it won't even mention prices. I have seen old Webster's dictionaries where they define the word inflation and they don't even mention prices. They simply define inflation as an expansion in the supply of money and credit, and they leave it at that. It was at some point in the future that they added the effect of inflation on the general price level.
Very Orwellian. The government does this, since they control most of the media. They can do this, and they can just change it. Then you have people like this guy that Peter Schiff is talking about, saying, "No, it's not. No, it's not. I disagree. I disagree," but not really saying what it is. Right? Prices go up and they go down. They don't inflate. Money supply inflates. Balloons inflate. My belly inflates.
But of course, if you get a dictionary today, if you look up inflation in a 2020 edition of Webster's dictionary, they're not going to mention money supply. It's simply going to say inflation is an increase in the general price level. So the definition has simply been altered over time, but that doesn't actually change the real meaning of the word. But this is what we see all the time, right? This happens with the Constitution, right, where definitions are changed, right? The government changes the way terms are defined, the same way that we measure economic statistics. The government changes the way inflation is measured. The government changes the way GDP is measured. The government changes the way unemployment is measured, right? They're always changing the meaning of words to try to advance a political agenda. And that's exactly what's happened with the word inflation. And so I think people need to stay true to reality. I don't care if the government wants to misdefine inflation. I don't care if the Federal Reserve wants to misdefine inflation. That doesn't mean that we should do it too. People that actually understand what inflation is need to call it what it is. They need.
That's so true, and you should, when you're talking to people and they make that, you should just gently, but consistently correct their wording. And it's because it's the decades of this changing of the definition of the word has crept into society, and now for the most people don't even believe the government is the cause of this. You have a lot of schools, and my son graduated high school in Illinois. Economics wasn't even a required class to graduate. Probably a good thing now because they probably teach all kinds of things that weren't, they probably teach all the fake stuff, the false stuff, the socialist stuff. But it's not even. I mean, you can't really. Well, I guess you could. Basic supply and demand shouldn't have a political component to it, but it does. Keynes has his way of doing things. Mises, von Hayek had their way of doing things, and they're diametrically opposed in so many ways. From a Christian perspective, though, there's a book out, and it's Gary North is the author. Again, another Austrian guy who subscribes to the Austrian School of Economics, and he has a book called Honest Money. And it's his stuff. They say it's simple. His stuff is not simple. I don't think, at least. It's because the terms a lot of times are foreign to us because our brains have been immersed in government propaganda for the most part, right? But that book, from a Christian perspective, talks about how that God expects honest money, and the Proverbs are replete with examples of this, of the honest scales, and this whole erosion of the value of the store of money. God's not a fan of it all. I mean, he talks very clearly about how bad that is for society, right? But I totally recommend that book, Honest Money. But if I could read one book that kind of leans Austrian, is be Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. I think that's mandatory reading for anybody at any time, and now it really is simple.
Need to describe inflation accurately. The word itself, inflate. And I keep talking about this. If you even think about the word inflation, what does that mean? Inflate means to expand, right? If you inflate something, you expand it. When you inflate a balloon, right, you blow air into a balloon, what happens to the balloon? It expands, right? It gets larger.
Simple, right?
When you deflate a balloon, what happens to the balloon? It contracts. So inflation is an expansion. Deflation is a contraction. Prices don't inflate, right? Prices don't expand and contract. Prices go up and prices go down, right? So the word inflate was not meant to refer to prices, which can expand and contract. It was meant to refer to the supply of money and to the supply of credit, which can expand and contract. So I want to keep the original definition of inflation because that's key to understanding it. See, when you misdefine inflation as rising prices, the result is bad monetary policy and bad fiscal policy because the government, the central bank, can keep on inflating, and if all they're doing is looking at consumer prices and they don't see them going up and they think, oh, there's no inflation, they can keep on creating it, and inflation is doing a lot of damage. And of course, the other problem is the way they're measuring consumer prices is so flawed that you don't even see the effects of inflation because they're being masked behind a rigged CPI.
This is really good, and I'm going to stop right here because what he's talking about right now, and this video is a couple years old apparently, but Peter Schiff was recently on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and he talks specifically, and it's really crazy because you have two really smart guys talking together, and he actually talks and defines, and Jordan Peterson asks how is some of the best ways to measure this. And they get into a really deep conversation. If you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend and encourage you to listen to that.
So the government keeps on creating inflation, and then they point to this rigged CPI that says there's no inflation. It's like if you have a thermometer that's broken, right, and no matter what your temperature is, it says 98.6. You could be as sick as a dog, but if you keep relying on that thermometer, that broken thermometer, then you don't think you're sick. Well, you could ignore all the signs, right, that the patient is shivering and there's, they got all kinds of symptoms. But if you ignore the symptoms and just look at that broken thermometer, right, the guy's going to eventually die because you're relying on faulty equipment. That is what the Federal Reserve is doing when they're ignoring all of the other effects of inflation and just staring at this broken CPI and thinking that there's no problem. So anyway, I just want.
That's a great analogy, the broken thermometer. I love that analogy. It makes it really simple. Ignoring all the other symptoms, and we have them. I mean, I'm telling you, the fundamentals, the financial fundamentals don't make sense right now. And I'm concerned all we're doing is kicking the can down the road. Even right now, as I'm recording this video, we recently had another increase of the debt ceiling, and we all know that they weren't going to not approve an increase. Republicans acted in posturing, but they're just as guilty as the Democrats, and they're simply just going to keep spending and spending and spending, and the fundamentals aren't making any sense. And when the laws of economics take over, it's super scary.
I wanted to bring that up, and that that tweet is out there with that definition, but that basically proves that I was right in that bit of a debate. I mean, I got a lot of respect for Jim Rickards, but I wish he would get this one thing right. Stop falling into this trap. This is exactly what the government wants. This is exactly what the Federal Reserve wants. They want us to repeat their lie and to misdefine inflation. Well, I want to call it for what it is. Inflation is an expansion of supply of money and credit, and there's only one cause of inflation, and that is the U.S. government.
So there it is. Words matter, right? Definitions matter. And I know a lot of times in conversation, I'll ask somebody, what do you mean by that? And I'm not trying to be difficult, because I want to make sure that we're on the same definition. And when you're using words that you think mean the same and you have a conversation, it can go off the rails really easy. So Peter Schiff, I highly recommend, if you don't listen to his podcasts or his YouTube channel, I highly recommend you do it. He's one of the few that's out there sounding the alarm that there are some issues going on in our economy, and has been. And a lot of people will call him Dr. Doom or think other pejoratives, but he really has a strong sense of what's happening. And although some of the concepts he speaks about are complicated, he does a really great job of simplifying it. Because one of the things the Austrians, when I read some of their things, these guys and gals are super smart people, and sometimes they have a difficult time making it simple enough. And some things can't be simplified, but he does a really great job of making some of these concepts a little more understandable. So there you go. Inflation, the expansion of the money supply. It's the government's causing it, and they're on the hook for it. And as long as we don't hold them accountable, they'll get away with it. So thanks again for joining me for the Profit Dare. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you soon with a new video.